My name's Harrison Chase, CEO and co-founder of LangChain.
And could you give me a brief overview of what it is that LangChain does?
Yeah, LangChain's a developer framework that makes it easy to build LLM applications. So we have a bunch of integrations and abstractions for all the different components that go into developing LLM applications and more complex LLM applications than just a simple call to a language model. So particularly involved on connecting language models to your data, and then also using them in agentic ways, using them as an agent to think about what to do and to do that kind of like reasoning. So using the language as a reasoning engine and connecting it to external sources of data and computation.
And how did you kind of come up, it's a very obvious problem, and you're doing a fantastic job as the company. But how did you first come up and see that this was a problem? Because this, I guess, you started the company at the end of last year. This was kind of pre-GPT-4.
Yeah.
It was kind of around the time of ChatGPT, but you kind of had the foresight to realize this was a problem. Can you talk me through that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know if I had the foresight to realize it was a problem. Basically, what happened was I was chatting with a bunch of people who were building in the area and building some of these more complex things. And this was last September, October. So this was after like Jasper and Copy AI had come out, and we're doing a lot of generation of like marketing copy and stuff. But people were starting to think about, more, I would say, like personalized and connected things like that than that. And so I was chatting with a bunch of those folks, saw what I thought some common abstractions were. Started it as a side project. So again, didn't really had no clue whether this was like a big issue, a small issue. Just saw some common abstractions, thought it would be a fun week project to factor some stuff out, put it out there, and then kind of went from there.
And what was the first part you started with? What was the first kind of problem and integration or connection?
Yeah, I think I can go back and check my Twitter thread, but I think basically there was, I think the common abstractions that I saw were basically this idea of, and I think all the abstractions have actually changed since then because they were wrong, of course. But basically this idea of connecting language models to other things. So I think the three projects that I put in, one was like a NatBot, which was Nat Friedman's like web agent thing. So connecting a language model to reason about how to interact with the browser. Another, I think, was a SQL database chain. So using the LLM to generate SQL to then run that SQL, get back a response. And then I think the third was the retrieval augmented generation chain. So fetching documents, putting that in the prompt, returning the context there. Shortly after that, and this is when I think it really started to kind of like crystallize some of this stuff, was the React paper in using that kind of like prompting method to take arbitrary actions. And then always throughout this process, there was the idea of, again, like, I think the key part of this is a language model. And I wasn't going to train my own language model. So there's this idea of like just making it easy to swap in OpenAI versus Cohere at that point, and then eventually Anthropic and stuff like that. So I think this idea of like composability on the language model and then eventually on the vector store front became pretty important early on as well.
And at what point was it that as you said, you started this as just a bit of a project, I guess part-time. What point did you go, actually, this probably can be a business. People are, finding huge value here. Maybe we should start, doing this full time.
Yeah, so I knew I was going to leave my previous job, and this was kind of just a way for me to explore the space, really, and like see maybe is there an application that's worth building or something like that. I think I would say probably after like a month, I realized that there was like definitely some interest here, and then after like 2 months, which is basically right before Christmas break, and then I ended up leaving my job right after Christmas break, right after New Year's. So right about that, I was like, and that's when I really started working closely with my co-founder Ankush, and we started thinking more carefully about that.
Excellent. And for anyone who's kind of looked through your repo, you're posting stuff every hour of every day. Do you sleep?
Yes, luckily there's I mean. Like I say we're like 8 people, but if you look at the repo, I think we're up to there's really like 800 people or something like that.
Contributors.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think like my job right now is pretty easy. I think it's mostly just like code review, and there's a lot of like awesome PRs. Like, I think we merged. I think we're publicizing one today that we merged in yesterday from the Amazon team for their new like Amazon Bedrock service. And it was, it was a very fast review because they wrote the client to it in the first place. And so I think at this point it's, I don't think it's really fair to say that it's just the 8 of us, there absolutely is like 800 people, which makes it pretty easy.
Yeah, and that's a great thing about community.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole reason, I mean, I think there was 2 reasons that I started it open source. One was one was I just think this type of thing should be open source. Like I think this is, I think there are things that should be open source and there are things that shouldn't be open source. This is just clearly one of the things that should be open source. But the other thing was just to work with, to be honest, I wasn't thinking like random people on the internet, although I've met a lot of awesome random people on the internet now. Initially, I was thinking, some of my coworkers from like previous jobs would be fun to like reconnect with them and, hack with them. And some of my friends who were starting things, like maybe they could contribute as well. But I don't know, open source is awesome because you do get to work with like everyone.
Absolutely. Okay, and can you talk us through a little bit about, you just presented with Patricio, who's one of our senior ML engineers at MindsDB. Talk us through the kind of work you were doing with him, and
Yeah, I mean, Patricio did most of it. Let's give him all the credit here. I mean, I think like, but the basic idea is, there's a lot, like MindsDB connects a lot of data and makes it really easy to run machine learning applications, models. I don't know what exactly you'd call LangChains. They're not a model, they're kind of an application. It makes it really easy to connect it with that. And so, I think he knows the ins and outs of the MindsDB internals much better than I do, but basically like adding a way to run arbitrary LangChain chains and agents. I think he started with an agent and connect it to some of the data using MindsDB specific tools to do that. Which I think is a really powerful integration.
And what do you think some of the benefits to, like, I guess, your users and our users by having kind of this integration?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just brings the logic of the language models and the agents closer to where the data actually lives. So I think like there's this interesting, and again, it's super early on in the space, so I don't think like there's no like one way to do things. I think there's 2 kind of like paradigms that are emerging. One is like you have all your data and you move it into a new type of index that is better suited for these language models, things like vector stores and embeddings, and there's been a lot of talk about that. But there's also a completely valid and in a lot of cases better paradigm where you just interact with the data directly. And so I think bringing that power as close to the data directly as possible inside MindsDB is extremely powerful for that. And I think you guys are working on some awesome stuff around vector stores and embeddings as well. So maybe that will be a thing later as well.
That's great to hear. And so recently you have, I think this is probably partnered with Benchmark.
Yep.
You've got the jumper on the jacket on there, so it must be public. So MindsDB also, for transparency, did a funding round with Benchmark. Why did you choose Benchmark? We obviously know our reasons, but I'd love to hear why you guys chose to work with them.
Yeah, I think so Benchmark, I think, was basically a perfect combination of really hands-on, but at the same time thinking very long-term and very strategically. And I think that combination, given where we were at, which was there were 2 of us, so we wanted hands-on. Yeah. We wanted as much help, but at the same time, like, we did have a lot of open source traction, and we also thought this was a massive kind of like just market, and so we wanted that long-term strategic thinking as well. And so I think that combination, plus I think Miles, who's the partner there that we're working most closely with, I think we thought he was, and we thought the whole team as well, but him in particular, we interacted with him the most, was extremely good at thinking through things from first principles, which I think in this market, again, we think it's like super early on, still rapidly developing, and I think that's a huge plus.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you feel, once you kind of take that first investment check, it moves from this project, to a real business? Or, I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah.
How has that transitioned? Have you kind of had time to think about it, or yeah?
Haven't had a ton of time. Yeah, there's still been a lot to do in the open source, and I think like now that we're 8, we've recently started thinking about it a bit more. Up until like a month ago, I'd say basically everything that we did was in the open source and focused on that. And now we have the resources to put like 1 or 2 people on more things that we think are like commercially viable and stuff like that. But I think part of what we liked about Benchmark as well is I think they recognize that it's super early on in the space, and so where I think the best thing that we can do right now is just build what actually is like really useful, as opposed to trying to capture value on something, because things are just moving so fast, right? And so I think if you try to capture value on things that are useful now, there's a pretty good chance that those won't be relevant in whatever time period. And so I think really focusing on what actually is useful, even if that means just, working on just moving as fast as possible on some of the open source stuff, because that's where things are going to be in 6 months, and then skating for that puck. That was something that Benchmark was always extremely aligned on, and so it's been very fun to work with them on that.
Fantastic. Yeah, not everyone is aligned as Benchmark. So what are some kind of exciting ways that you've seen, LangChain being used that you never predicted when you started it, in Q4 last year?
I mean, honestly, the Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master thing that Patricio did, I think there was another demo of that, but I think like that's actually a really good, like when I think about it now, it makes sense because because it's creative, and so I think there's a higher tolerance for errors. Like if it messes up, it's not that bad. There's a lot of but it's not just a call to a language. It's more than just a call to a language model, because you want to ground it in the experience that you have. Whether for Patricio's demo, it was the kind of like the monsters and the setting that were in the database, or there's another demo that did it, or another project that did something where it was like the quest actually went on over time, and so the dungeon master had to keep track of state, and so this was this idea of like keeping track of state, making it personalized, but also being creative. And so I think like that was one that I definitely didn't expect, but I think makes a ton of sense in terms of LangChain combining language models with data, with reasoning, right? It's kind of like a perfect marriage of all those.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of talk out there about AI taking people's jobs, but you never probably would have thought that the dungeon master would be first on the chopping block. How do you see LangChain assisting researchers, engineers in the kind of AutoML space?
In the AutoML space?
AutoML space, yeah.
In what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, just obviously there's this new up-and-coming trend, like Ludwig, SageMaker. There's a lot of tools that are designed or built for people who maybe not super technical, and then kind of combining that with LangChain. Like, how do you kind of see that progressing?
I mean, I think there's I think there's maybe like two ways that I'd answer this, and happy to dive more on either one. But I think one is basically, a lot of LangChain is aimed at making it really easy for kind of like non-technical people to get started with. I mean, that's the chains are kind of like preset combinations of that. And so I think like a lot of LangChain is similar in that vein, but just for a different type of problems than traditional AutoML things. There's also like another more maybe interesting kind of like paradigm as well, where the language models can use those AutoML systems to do AutoML or something like that, a layer on top of AutoML. I haven't explored that one as much, but I think the idea of using, it still requires some human intervention to select the right toggles, do the right data upload, pass in the right parameters to this thing. Having a language model do that is interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen anyone do that, but that would be pretty interesting to explore.
Excellent. And this one's from one of our engineers. What are some of the surprising ways that people have done to speed up chains? Because obviously sometimes they can be very slow. Like, what have people been working on?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's maybe two areas to approach this. One is like without changing the structure of the chain, like what can you do? The main thing there is use different models at different parts of the chain. Like you don't need to use GPT-4 for everything. You can use GPT 3.5 Turbo for a part, and that will speed up that part. And then if you do that at enough places, that'll speed up the overall chain. The other thing is to change the chain itself, or change the agent itself. And I think this is only doable once you really narrow down the exact use case that you have. So I think it's like very reasonable to start with like a broad chain, start with a broad agent. Then you figure out, I really need to only do like this step, and this step can actually be taken out if I just do this slight prompt tweak to put this additional context in. And so I think, people, and it's very context specific though, but I think, generally plugging in smaller models for parts of the chain that can be smaller, and then adjusting the chain dynamically.
Fantastic. And what is the opportunity to kind of talk about some stuff that you're working on? Is there anything you kind of would like to kind of,
Yeah, I think I mean, one of the things there's a lot of things that I'm really excited about. So how much time do I have? One of the things that we're most actively working on is the idea of going from prototype to production. And there's a few things there. One is kind of like the deployment and systems aspect of that. And I think that's, I think it's more or less known what needs to be done there. That's actually not where we're focused on at the moment. We're more focused on the reliability aspect of these things, particularly with agents. So I still think it's very tricky to get them to work reliably. And I think and I think there's a lot of things that we can be doing to make that easier. And I think a lot of it comes back to evaluation. And I think evaluation of these systems in general is really hard, or of these models in general is really hard. And now you've got these systems built around these agents. How do you evaluate that? And I think if you can do evaluation well, that allows you to basically properly compare different prompts, different models. Also, that starts to imply some semblance of like a data set which you're accumulating, which can then be used to feed back into the process to improve it. And so I think getting that like evaluation flywheel turning is where we're focusing a lot of our energy at the moment, and we should have some stuff to share there pretty shortly.
Exciting stuff. And so kind of a more general question. So there's a lot of conversation right now about regulation of AI. Sam Altman has been touring the world, talking to regulators, calling to Congress, the European Parliament. I don't think anyone really knows the right answer yet, but I'd love to get your take on kind of where we're heading.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's really complicated and really nuanced, and so I probably don't have a great answer here. I think the only thing that I'll add and again, we don't really like train models. So for a lot of the model training stuff, I actually don't know if I should even be the one opining there. But I think where we where we can opine is like I think it starts to get really dangerous when you connect these models to a bunch of tools, where LangChain is really involved. And so that's something we're thinking about is like, like we have like the Python REPL tool, which I think Patricio showed off. That can go wrong in so many different ways, and so that's something that's like absolutely not recommended for production at the moment. And so I think there's I think there's the question of the underlying models themselves and the capability of those models, and I don't think I'm the right person to opine on that. But then I think there's the question of okay, now if these models can connect to tools like. And more from a framework of like, what framework, what do we need in a framework to make sure that nothing bad happens there? And should that framework be regulated? I think again, super early, super nuanced, but I think personally that's when it starts to get really dangerous. And so thinking about that is definitely the back of my
and to
mind.
be fair, it's not something that I've heard conversations about, right? Because the focus is so much on kind of these large language models and potentially GPT-5 and 6 and what they can do that actually those connections are not really talked about terribly much. But you're in the space. And maybe,
I think because I think like there's absolutely, so if you think about like what a really powerful system could look like, the thing that's needed is like a really powerful language model. And so I think it makes sense to focus on that. But that's not like But that's not sufficient. Like if you just have that by itself, it's necessary but not sufficient. So like you have an API that you could talk to, but like just because you can talk to an API doesn't, I think there's limits in terms of what that means. It starts when you start using it in applications, when you start using it in a way where its output. I mean, even when it's just passing back to users, that's at the application level. That you want to make sure it's not saying bad things and stuff like that. And then if you take it up another level, it's when you start doing things programmatically based on the output. But that's a system that's built around it. And I think it's right again to focus on like the language models to start because that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so I think like. Yeah, it's very nuanced.
Yeah. And I think one thing's for certain is regulators never get it right the first time. They're gonna either under-regulate or over-regulate, and then hopefully in a reasonably speedy time they'll get it right. But fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Harrison, for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add at the end?
No, thank you guys for having me. This has been a blast.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.